Hey there, survivors. It's David here. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started.
Thanks for stopping by. When our channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a lottery giveaway, and one new subscriber will win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and be in the race before it's too late. Before everything broke, the city trained us to believe in continuity. Streets reopened after construction. Power outages came with estimates. Sirens meant response, not warning. Even emergencies followed scripts that implied resolution. We lived inside systems that corrected themselves quickly enough to feel permanent, even when they weren't. I worked near the river, close enough to smell fuel and rust on hot days. Fireboats passed occasionally, slow and utilitarian, never dramatic. They were part of the background infrastructure, like hydrants or emergency stairwells. You noticed them only when something had already gone wrong somewhere else. Otherwise, they waited. The first cracks didn't look like collapse, they looked like inconvenience. Traffic stalled longer than usual. A fire burned unchecked for hours across town because crews were delayed. Social media filled the gaps with speculation, then moved on. No one panicked because panic assumes finality. This felt temporary. I remember standing on an overpass watching gridlock harden into something immovable. Drivers abandoned lanes to reroute, then got stuck sideways. Engines overheated, horns lost meaning. That was the first time I noticed how fragile motion really was. Roads only work when everyone agrees they do. The outbreak didn't arrive as spectacle. It arrived as friction. Ambulances stopped threading through congestion. Police lines formed, then dissolved. Information lagged behind behavior. By the time reports mentioned violence unrelated to fires or accidents, the city had already begun moving differently. I tried to leave on foot at first. Everyone did. Side streets filled with people carrying bags that suggested overestimation. Pets, suitcases, framed photos. You could see optimism in what people chose to bring. They expected destinations. They expected doors to open for them. That expectation collapsed fast. Bridges closed without warning. Tunnels reversed flow, then locked entirely. Crowds thickened near bottlenecks, pressing forward without coordination. That pressure created its own danger long before the infected reached us. It was near the river that I first saw someone move wrong. Not aggressive, not fast, just misaligned with everything around them. They stumbled into traffic without reacting to impact. Drivers swerved, then froze. No one helped. That hesitation spread faster than panic would have. I backed away toward the waterfront because it offered space. Space felt safer than direction. That instinct saved me, though I didn't know it yet. Along the docks, city noise thinned. Sound traveled farther but arrived cleaner. I could hear water against hulls, ropes knocking gently, engines idling without urgency. That's when I noticed the fireboat. It sat where it always had, paint faded, name barely legible. No crew aboard, no lights active. It looked forgotten, which was unusual because the city rarely forgot assets completely. Budget cuts neglect things, but abandonment implies assumption. Someone assumed it wouldn't be needed. The shoreline filled behind me as more people arrived, drawn by the same instinct for space. Most of them looked past the boat entirely. They were watching the streets, waiting for order to return. I was watching the water. The river still moved. Tides didn't care about outbreaks. Current carried debris steadily downstream. That consistency felt like permission. Land had become argumentative. Water remained indifferent. I didn't think of the fireboat as escape. I thought of it as movement. Movement without intersections. Movement without crowds. It wasn't fast and it wasn't subtle, but it didn't require cooperation from thousands of strangers. The city behind me grew louder in a way I hadn't heard before. not shouting. Fragmented sound. Sharp, uncoordinated, overlapping. The kind that signals systems talking over each other instead of together. I understood then that permanence had been a shared agreement, not a guarantee. Once that agreement broke, everything designed around it failed quickly. Roads, schedules, response times, all of it depended on belief. The Fireboat didn't depend on belief. It depended on fuel, mechanics, and water depth. Those were problems I could see and measure. Standing there, watching the shoreline tighten with indecision, I realized staying put meant inheriting the city's collapse. Moving meant uncertainty, but it also meant refusing to be pinned in place by assumptions that no longer applied. The city hadn't fallen yet. It was still standing, still loud, still recognizable. That was the dangerous part. It looked permanent right up until the moment it wasn't. The fires didn't scare anyone at first. They never do. Cities burn in small, controlled ways all the time. A kitchen mishap, an electrical fault, a dumpster catching because someone tossed the wrong thing in the wrong place. Fire is familiar when response is guaranteed. What unsettled me wasn't the flames. It was the waiting. The first one burned 3 blocks inland, visible from the river as a thin column of smoke that should have triggered a cascade of sirens. None came. I stood on the dock watching it thicken, darken, then spread sideways as wind took interest. Minutes passed. Then more. Boats moved lazily past as if nothing unusual was happening. On land, people gathered at a distance, phones raised, still expecting engines to arrive. They didn't. Someone near me muttered about delays. Another blamed staffing shortages. Those explanations used to work because they assumed a correction was coming. The fire didn't correct itself. It climbed, jumped structures, and began feeding on whatever it found. Only then did the crowd's posture change. Not panic, confusion. People kept looking down the street instead of at the fire, waiting for authority to appear. I checked emergency channels on my phone. Updates lagged, repeated, contradicted each other. One alert claimed units were en route. Another asked people to avoid the area without explaining why. The gap between message and reality widened fast enough to notice. That same afternoon, another fire started closer to the waterfront. Smaller, but louder. Glass shattered. Alarms triggered without coordination. Still no response. I remember realizing how much reassurance came from sirens alone. Even before help arrives, the sound tells you someone has acknowledged the problem. Silence does the opposite. The fireboat sat unmoved as smoke drifted overhead. I watched people glance at it, then away, as if it were decorative. No one approached it. No one asked about it. The assumption was simple. If it mattered, someone official would be there already. That assumption began collapsing in real time. By evening, multiple fires burned across the city. Some burned themselves out. Others didn't. News footage looped the same images from different angles, never clarifying what wasn't being shown. Commentators spoke carefully, filling air without adding substance. They avoided saying what everyone was starting to feel, that coordination was slipping. I stayed near the water because it gave perspective. From there, the city looked less like a grid and more like a collection of independent failures. Fire here, darkness there, traffic frozen between them. Everything that relied on synchronized response started drifting out of alignment. That's when I noticed something else missing. The sound of water cannons. Fireboats don't move quietly. When they deploy, you feel it through the hulls tied nearby. Nothing stirred. The river remained oddly calm, as if it had been excluded from the emergency. I walked closer to the boat, close enough to see corrosion along the rail and the faded insignia on its side. It hadn't been serviced recently. That much was obvious. But neglect isn't the same as uselessness. Machines fail loudly when they're broken. This one was just dormant. Another fire flared after sunset, close enough that embers drifted toward the docks. People backed away instinctively, pressed closer to the water, then stopped when they realized there was nowhere else to go. No instructions came. No barriers formed. The city didn't collapse, it stalled. That stall was worse than chaos. Chaos invites reaction, stalls invite waiting. I overheard fragments of conversation that revealed the shift before anyone named it. They're overwhelmed. They're prioritizing. They told us to shelter. Each phrase assumed someone was still making decisions somewhere above the confusion. But fires don't respect hierarchy. They respond to physics. At one point, a man ran down to the dock yelling for help, not knowing who he was yelling at. His building was burning. He kept pointing back towards the street as if someone might materialize behind him if he explained clearly enough. No one did. Eventually, he stopped yelling and just stood there, watching smoke rise. That was the moment I understood the fires weren't the problem. They were the signal. They showed which systems still worked and which ones didn't. Fire response depends on speed, access, and coordination. When all three fail at once, you don't get partial response. You get nothing. The Fireboat was designed for moments like this, not for heroics, but for reach, for when streets fail and water remains. The fact that it sat unused while fires spread told me everything I needed to know. No one had ordered it into service. No crew had arrived to take it out. Either they couldn't or they were dealing with something worse elsewhere. Both possibilities mattered. As night settled, the city glowed unevenly. Pockets of light and flame scattered without pattern. From the river it looked fragile in a way I'd never seen before. Not broken, unmanaged. I stopped thinking about whether help was coming and started thinking about what still worked. Roads didn't. Signals didn't. Authority didn't move fast enough to matter. Water did. The first fires no one responded to taught me a simple lesson before the undead ever reached the docks. When response disappears, infrastructure reveals its true value. The Fireboat wasn't heroic. It was just overlooked. And in a city built on assumption, being overlooked suddenly felt like the safest place to be. The roads failed before the dead ever made them impassable. That's what most people misunderstand when they talk about evacuation. They imagine hordes, violence, blockage by force. What actually stops movement first is hesitation multiplied by volume. Too many people trying to decide at the same time turns direction into friction. I saw it from above the riverbank. Streets that had always flowed began to thicken, then lock. Lanes lost meaning once drivers started improvising. Someone abandoned a car at an angle that blocked two directions at once. Another tried to reverse against traffic that no longer recognized rules. Horns blared until they didn't. Sound lost authority when no one believed movement was possible. I tried crossing a bridge on foot and didn't make it halfway. The crowd stalled not because of danger ahead, but because information had stopped. People kept asking each other what was happening, expecting clarity to surface if enough voices repeated the question. It never did. Rumors moved faster than bodies. Every step forward came with a new reason to stop. Emergency vehicles became obstacles instead of solutions. Ensure clear paths didn't stay clear. When an ambulance stalled, no one knew whether to move for it or move away from it. That uncertainty spread outward, freezing entire intersections. I realized then that roads don't fail when they're blocked. They fail when they lose trust. The first infected appeared sporadically, not in waves. One at a time, out of place, easy to miss until they weren't. A person collapsing in traffic didn't register as threat immediately. People assumed medical emergency, not contagion. By the time recognition caught up, space had already vanished. I watched someone try to drag an injured stranger out of the road, only to be pulled down themselves. The crowd surged backward, then stopped again, caught between instinct and immobility. Vehicles boxed each other in. Doors opened, then slammed shut. No one could commit to a direction long enough to move. I backed away from the street as the pressure increased. Roads concentrate danger because they promise exit. When that promise breaks, panic has nowhere to release. Sidewalks filled with people carrying too much, trying to protect items that made movement harder. Every possession became an anchor. I realized then that land routes didn't just stop working. They inverted. The faster you tried to move, the more exposed you became. Speed drew attention. Attention drew contact. Contact multiplied risk. The streets rewarded stillness briefly, then punished it all at once. I saw a man climb onto the roof of his car to look ahead. He didn't get down. Someone grabbed his ankle. Someone else grabbed his arm. The crowd reacted without coordination, pulling in opposite directions. The car rocked, then shifted, then crushed space beneath it. I turned away before the sound resolved. What made it worse was how familiar everything looked. Traffic lights still cycled uselessly. Store signs glowed as if nothing had changed. Pavement markings pointed toward destinations that no longer existed. The city kept giving instructions that no longer applied, and people kept trying to follow them out of habit. I thought about taking a bike, then dismissed it. Wheels don't matter when space is gone. I thought about cutting through alleys, but those filled faster than streets. Everyone had the same idea at once. Shared logic became a liability. From the waterfront, I could see how movement failed in layers. First cars, then foot traffic, then emergency response. Each failure amplified the next. The undead didn't need to overrun the city. The city had already immobilized itself. That's when the river stopped feeling peripheral. Water doesn't promise destinations. It offers direction without instruction. Current doesn't stall because too many people want the same thing. It keeps moving whether you're ready or not. I watched someone try to force a path through stalled traffic with a truck, only to get trapped when fuel ran out. I watched others abandon vehicles that would never move again, stepping into crowds that had no structure left. The roads became storage for bad decisions made too late. Land mobility assumes cooperation. It assumes lanes, signals, mutual patience. The outbreak stripped those assumptions away faster than infrastructure could adapt. By the time people understood that roads were liabilities, they were already embedded inside them. I moved back towards the docks with purpose for the first time that day. Not because I knew exactly what I was going to do, but because I knew what I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't going to let the city decide my speed. The fireboat came back into my thinking not as an escape hatch, but as an alternative logic. It didn't care about gridlock. It didn't require permission from strangers. It didn't funnel thousands into the same narrow choices. The roads led nowhere because nowhere was where everyone was trying to go. Survival wasn't about finding the right route anymore. It was about leaving the system that demanded agreement to function. Land had become a negotiation with too many participants and no mediator. Water didn't negotiate. It moved. That was the moment I understood that staying mobile on land wasn't just dangerous. It was impossible. The shoreline filled faster than the streets emptied. People drifted toward it instinctively, pulled by the promise of space and the absence of walls. From a distance, the river looked calm, indifferent to the noise stacking behind us. Up close, it felt like a line everyone understood without agreeing on why. Crowds gathered unevenly along docks, ramps, and broken steps. Some waited, staring across the water as if expecting it to explain itself. Others argued about boats they didn't own or routes they couldn't name. No one coordinated because no one had authority left to listen to. The waterline became a meeting place for decisions that should have been made earlier. I noticed how quickly people sorted themselves without realizing it. Those who understood boats stood apart, scanning hulls and moorings with practiced eyes. Those who didn't hovered closer to land, unwilling to commit to something they couldn't predict. That gap widened with every minute. Knowledge turned into distance. The infected reached the edge later than expected, slowed by congestion and confusion. When they did, the effect was immediate. The shoreline compressed. People surged toward planks and ladders that hadn't been built for crowds. Several fell into the water fully clothed, thrashing in ways that drew attention they couldn't manage. Panic didn't spread evenly. It concentrated where options narrowed. I watched a man try to push a small boat free with 3 strangers already inside. The motor flooded. He kept pulling the cord anyway, eyes fixed on the sound rather than the approaching danger. When it didn't start, no one spoke. They simply scattered, abandoning the boat and each other at the same time. The river didn't offer escape so much as separation. It created a pause between decisions, a buffer that land no longer provided. That pause was valuable, but it wasn't infinite. Boats moved slowly when overloaded. Docks broke under pressure. The water punished mistakes differently, but it punished them all the same. What struck me most was how few people looked beyond the first few meters. They focused on reaching water, not on what came after. Getting off land felt like a solution, even when it wasn't. I understood the impulse. Boundaries feel safer than routes when you're overwhelmed. The fireboat sat just beyond the densest cluster, too large to be useful to most people, too complex to understand at a glance. It didn't attract attention because it didn't look like an answer. It looked like work. I realized then how survival favors those willing to accept effort over immediacy. As the shoreline tightened, arguments grew shorter and more physical. Gestures replaced sentences. Hands stayed on railings longer than necessary. The waterline stopped being neutral ground. It became a contested edge where hesitation cost space and decisiveness invited retaliation. I stayed back, watching patterns instead of faces. Boats that left early moved cleanly. Boats that waited took damage before they cleared the dock. Timing mattered more than size or speed. The river rewarded commitment, not negotiation. The undead didn't flood the water. They didn't need to. Their presence altered behavior enough to turn people against each other. Fear redirected itself horizontally when it couldn't move forward. The shoreline amplified that redirection, turning neighbors into obstacles. I stepped onto the fireboat only when the pressure shifted behind me, when staying meant being absorbed into a crowd that no longer behaved like individuals. The deck felt solid underfoot, heavier than anything around it. That weight mattered. It resisted the chaos instead of reflecting it. As the lines were cast off, the boundary moved with us. Land noise dulled, water noise sharpened. The city didn't recede so much as lose coherence. From the river, the shoreline looked like a held breath finally released. The waterline had divided the city into before and after, not by distance, but by choice. Once crossed, you weren't escaping. You were committing to a different set of rules. Crossing that edge stripped away hesitation and replaced it with momentum, because the river demanded action without debate, and once movement began, it refused to pause for second thoughts or collective agreement, leaving only commitment and consequence in its wake. The fireboat hadn't survived because anyone protected it. It survived because no one remembered to remove it. Budget cuts hollowed out departments unevenly, stripping staff before assets, leaving machinery tied to docks with no one assigned to justify its existence. The boat became a line item no one wanted to argue over, too expensive to dismantle, too specialized to repurpose. It stayed because forgetting was easier than deciding. I knew its history only in fragments. Built decades earlier for industrial fires that no longer happened. Designed to pump water at volumes most modern systems didn't need anymore. When waterfront warehouses closed and shipping shifted elsewhere, the boat lost relevance without losing capability. It became a backup to backups, maintained just enough to pass inspection, never enough to inspire confidence. That neglect worked in our favor. The fireboat wasn't attractive. Its paint had faded into a color that suggested durability rather than speed. Rust crept along seams where salt had been allowed to linger. It didn't look like escape. It looked like labor. Most people gravitated towards smaller boats, lighter hulls, things that promised immediacy. They wanted something that would move now, not something that demanded understanding. The Fireboat demanded understanding. Its size intimidated casual use. Boarding it required commitment. You didn't stumble onto a fireboat. You chose it, knowing you'd have to manage weight, power, and noise. That barrier filtered out desperation. Desperate people look for shortcuts. The Fireboat offered none. I checked access points carefully. Locks had been cut weeks earlier, not recently. Someone had considered taking it before, then walked away. That mattered. It suggested the boat wasn't impossible to operate, just inconvenient under pressure. Inconvenience keeps resources untouched longer than security ever does. Inside, the layout was unapologetically functional. No passenger seating. No comfort features. Gauges instead of displays. Valves instead of buttons. Everything assumed training, not intuition. That complexity slowed people down, which meant it stayed unused while faster options disappeared. The engine room smelled of old fuel and oil that had been changed on schedule without enthusiasm. Belts showed wear but not neglect. Batteries held charge. Someone had done the minimum required year after year without imagining a moment like this. I understood that mindset intimately. Maintenance without expectation preserves more than preparedness with arrogance ever does. What mattered most was redundancy. Fireboats are built to fail safely. Multiple pumps, independent systems, backup controls that don't care about software updates or network access. In a city unraveling through miscommunication, that independence was priceless. The boat didn't need permission to run. It needed fuel, air, and someone willing to stay with it once it started. The dock around it told the same story, cleared just enough to avoid hazard reports. Never modernized, never crowded. While people fought over smaller vessels closer to ramps and signage, the Fireboat sat outside the flow of panic. Its position alone filtered attention. I tested systems quickly, not thoroughly. Thoroughness wasn't possible. What I needed was viability, not perfection. The engine coughed, then caught. The vibration traveled through the hull with a weight that felt reassuring. Heavy machines announce themselves honestly. If something is wrong, you know it immediately. Noise drew glances from the shoreline. A few people looked towards the boat, assessed it, then looked away. Too big, too slow, too loud. That dismissal bought us time. Misjudgment by others is an advantage you can't manufacture. I realized then why the Fireboat had been left behind. It existed in a gap between usefulness and desire, too specialized for panic, too cumbersome for theft, too obscure for nostalgia. Those gaps are where survival tools hide. The Fireboat hadn't been preserved for a moment like this. It had simply been spared from optimization. Modern systems strip away excess until nothing remains but efficiency. Efficiency collapses under stress. Redundancy endures. As lines were cast off and the shoreline reseeded, the city didn't react. No alarms. No pursuit. The Fireboat left quietly in its own way, not because it was subtle, but because it had never been part of anyone's plan. That anonymity was its greatest strength. Not invisibility, but irrelevance. In a city obsessed with speed and convenience, the Fireboat had been overlooked long enough to become essential. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't ideal. It was still there. And that was enough. The moment I turned the ignition, I understood why no one else had tried. The engine didn't respond with confidence. It responded with resistance. Metal complained before it cooperated. The sound wasn't reassuring or smooth. It was raw, mechanical, and loud enough to announce itself across the water. For a second, nothing happened. That pause carried more weight than noise ever could. People on the dock looked up, drawn by expectation rather than sound. Some stepped closer, others stepped back. Attention gathered unevenly, and attention is dangerous when it doesn't know what it's watching. I adjusted the throttle carefully, remembering fragments of instruction that had never been meant for crisis. Fireboats aren't designed for quick starts. They're designed to come online under control, when crews have time to verify pressure, flow, and balance. I had none of that. Every second spent waiting invited more eyes. The engine caught with a shudder that travelled through the hull and into my legs. The vibration wasn't subtle, it wasn't meant to be. This was a machine built to overpower resistance, not hide from it. The noise flattened distance, bouncing off concrete and water until it filled the shoreline with certainty. Someone shouted something I couldn't make out. Another person ran closer, hands raised, not in threat, but in appeal. The fireboat didn't care. Once running, it demanded focus. Gauges climbed unevenly. Pressure stabilized slower than I liked. I forced myself not to rush adjustments that could make things worse. The smell changed immediately. Old fuel burned off impurities that had settled during long inactivity. The air filled with something sharp and industrial, a reminder that this wasn't a recreational vessel. It wasn't forgiving. Mistakes wouldn't stall it gently. They would escalate. Lines were still tied. That mattered. A running engine without movement is an invitation. I moved deliberately, releasing tension in sequence rather than cutting loose in panic. Rope burned against my palms. The sound felt louder than it should have been, amplified by awareness. On shore, the crowd shifted. Some people backed away from the noise. Others moved toward it, drawn by the implication of movement. I avoided eye contact. Engagement slows departure. The fireboat didn't have room for negotiation, physically or strategically. I pushed off harder than intended, the hull responding with inertia rather than agility. Fireboats don't leap forward. They commit slowly, mass asserting itself against resistance. That delay was agonizing. The shoreline didn't rush us. It pressed closer through perception alone. The moment the boat cleared the dock, I felt the difference. Water absorbed sound differently than concrete. Noise spread, but it lost direction. The engine settled into a rhythm that felt less like chaos and more like momentum. Not fast, not smooth, relentless. Steering required adjustment. The rudder responded with weight, lagging behind intention. I compensated instinctively, learning its temperament in real time. This wasn't a machine you commanded. It was one you negotiated with, constantly. The shoreline noise changed character. Shouts blended into a single texture, then faded. Movement on land became harder to track as distance increased. The infected near the docks reacted to sound, but not with coordination. They moved erratically, delayed by obstacles that meant nothing to water. That's when the fear shifted, not gone, reframed. On land, danger closes fast. On water, it accumulates. The fireboat didn't remove risk. It redistributed it along a timeline that could be managed if attention held. I checked fuel again. Levels were adequate, but adequacy isn't comfort. Consumption on a vessel like this isn't linear. Speed, load, and water conditions all compound demand. Running meant committing to ongoing calculation. Stopping wouldn't be neutral anymore. As the city slid sideways rather than backward, I realized how final the sound of the engine had been. Starting it wasn't just mechanical. It declared separation. Anyone watching now understood that something had left the system they were trapped in. That declaration couldn't be taken back. Turning the engine off near shore would invite pressure I couldn't handle. The fireboat, once started, demanded continuation. It wasn't built for hesitation. I didn't feel relief. Relief assumes safety. What I felt was alignment. The machine was doing what it had been designed to do, finally, and I was moving with it rather than around it. That movement created options where none had existed minutes earlier. Starting something that wasn't meant to run casually had changed the rules instantly. The city no longer dictated my speed. The crowd no longer shaped my direction. The undead no longer controlled proximity. The fireboat didn't save us in that moment. It committed us. And once committed, there was no version of survival that involved turning back. The first thing I noticed once we were clear of the docks was how fear behaved when it lost friction. On land, panic stacks. It ricochets between walls, vehicles, bodies. Every reaction triggers another. On water, fear spreads out instead of multiplying. It doesn't disappear, but it thins, stretched by distance and current until it becomes manageable. The fireboat cut a deliberate path upriver, heavy enough to ignore smaller debris, slow enough to keep control. The wake rolled outward in wide arcs, disturbing the surface without announcing urgency. That mattered. Speed on water attracts attention the way screaming does on land. Steady movement blends into expectation. I kept expecting pursuit. Sirens, boats launching behind us. None came. The infected don't swim with purpose, and the living had already committed to land routes they couldn't abandon easily. Water demanded different skills, different assumptions. Most people never learned them. The river widened as we moved away from the city's densest sections. Sound lost its edges. The engine's vibration became background instead of signal. I adjusted throttle until we found a balance between momentum and discretion. Too slow invited interception. Too fast burned fuel we couldn't replace. That balance became the rhythm of survival. From the deck, I watched the shoreline slide past in fragments. Abandoned docks, half-burned structures. Vehicles stopped where roads met water, their presence marking indecision more clearly than damage. None of it reached for us. The river created a buffer without walls, a moving boundary that shifted constantly. I understood then why mobility mattered more than destination. The undead weren't hunters in the way stories make them. They were accumulations. They formed where movement stalled. They clogged routes, thickened intersections, gathered around noise and hesitation. On water, accumulation failed. Nothing lingered long enough to build pressure. That didn't make us safe. It made us dynamic. Human threats behave differently too. On land, desperation collapses into proximity. On water, it announces itself early. Another vessel approaching carries intent before it carries risk. Course, speed, angle, these details speak before words ever do. I learned to read them quickly. We passed a small boat drifting aimlessly, its motor dead, its occupants silent. They watched us without signaling. I didn't slow. Stopping creates negotiation. Negotiation costs time. Time attracts attention. The fireboat's size made refusal implicit. It wasn't unkind, it was unavoidable. Fear aboard shifted inward. Instead of scanning for immediate threat, we tracked consumption, fuel, fatigue, heat. Water drains resources differently. You don't sprint from danger. You outlast it. That demands discipline rather than adrenaline. The engine temperature climbed slowly as the current pushed back. I adjusted intake, listening for changes that suggested strain. Mechanical awareness replaced situational panic. Hands busy with gauges don't shake as much. Focus has a calming effect fear can't override. Night fell unevenly along the river. Light pooled around us, then disappeared into black stretches broken only by reflection. The city glow faded behind bends and elevation changes. Without artificial reference points, distance became abstract. We moved through darkness that didn't feel threatening, just unknown. I realized then that water stripped fear of narrative. There was no ahead or behind in the way land creates it. Only relative position. Only momentum. Zombies didn't chase. People didn't cluster. The river didn't care who we were. That indifference was powerful. We adjusted routines quickly. Watches rotated. Noise minimized, lights shaded. The fireboat became less a vehicle and more a system we inhabited. Movement wasn't escape anymore. It was posture. The river taught us something land never could. Danger isn't always something you outrun. Sometimes it's something you refuse to let settle around you. Stillness had been the enemy from the beginning. On water, stillness was optional. When we finally slowed near a quieter stretch, it wasn't relief I felt. It was clarity. Mobility hadn't removed fear. It had reorganized it into something that could be monitored, rationed, and managed. That was the difference. Fear on land demanded reaction. Fear on water demanded attention. And attention, unlike panic, could be sustained. The hardest part wasn't starting the fireboat. It was deciding who stayed on it once it moved. Capacity isn't a suggestion on water. It's math enforced by physics. Every extra body changed how the hull sat, how the engine worked, how much fuel disappeared per hour. Choice became arithmetic under pressure. People reached the deck before we cleared the docks. Some climbed without asking. Others waited, hands on rails, eyes searching for permission I wasn't prepared to give. I hadn't planned to be in charge of anything. Authority arrived anyway, carried by access. If you control movement, you control outcomes, whether you want that responsibility or not. I counted weight instead of faces. That felt cruel. But cruelty implies intent. This was necessity. The fireboat could carry equipment or people, not both at full capacity. Tools mattered. Water mattered. Fuel mattered most of all. Trading any of that for goodwill would shorten the range of every decision afterward. The first people I let stay were the ones who didn't argue. Not because they were better, but because they understood constraint immediately. They adjusted their position without being told, kept their voices low, watched their footing. Awareness became the admission price, and others tried to negotiate. They explained skills, connections, promises. Some were useful, some weren't. Utility mattered, but predictability mattered more. In confined space, volatility multiplies. I chose calm over competence when forced to pick. A woman with a medical bag met my eyes without pleading. She didn't step forward. She waited. That restraint told me more than the contents of the bag. I nodded once. She boarded without celebration, immediately stowing equipment where it wouldn't interfere. She didn't ask where to sleep. A man with 2 children didn't wait. He pushed forward, voice rising as if volume could bend mass. I told him no once. He didn't hear it. Others around him reacted before I did, pulling him back not out of kindness, but self-preservation. Disorder on deck risks everyone. The fireboat didn't have space for that kind of pressure. I watched them from the wheel as we pushed off, the man shouting until the shoreline noise swallowed him. The children stopped crying first. Adults take longer to accept outcomes they can't change. That image stayed with me longer than I wanted. Guilt doesn't arrive immediately in moments like that. It waits. It shows up later during quieter hours, when your hands aren't busy and your eyes don't need to be sharp. In the moment, there was only calculation. I told myself that survival requires boundaries. That truth didn't make the boundary feel lighter. Once clear, the boat changed the conversation. Space enforced cooperation. People who had boarded began to adjust their expectations quickly. No one asked about destinations anymore. They asked about watches, fuel checks, noise discipline. Movement rewires priorities fast. We set rules without naming them. No running, no shouting, no lights unless shielded. Questions asked once, then dropped. The boat trained us into a shared rhythm without speeches. Anyone who disrupted that rhythm stood out immediately. One person tried to hoard water early, slipping bottles into a bag when they thought no one was looking. I noticed not because I was watching them, but because the balance shifted. Tension spreads through small spaces quickly. I didn't confront them publicly. I took the bag, redistributed supplies evenly, and said nothing else. The message landed harder that way. Another passenger surprised me. A mechanic who barely spoke spent hours in the engine room, learning its behavior without instruction. He didn't fix anything dramatically. He listened, adjusted, stabilized. Quiet competence is rare under stress. I moved him closer to decision-making without ceremony. Those who didn't come with us didn't vanish. They remained part of the river's memory. Shadows along the banks. Boats that followed briefly then fell behind. Figures watching from docks without signaling. Absence carried weight. Every empty space on deck had a story attached to it, whether we acknowledged it or not. I learned quickly that choosing who comes with you is also choosing who you become. The fireboat wasn't just transporting bodies, it was shaping behavior. Cooperation wasn't optional. It was enforced by proximity and motion. By the second night, no one asked to leave, not because they felt safe, but because they understood the cost of alternatives. Land had stopped offering choices. Water narrowed them but kept them moving. I didn't pretend the selections were fair. Fairness assumes surplus. We had none. We had momentum, fuel, and time measured in hours rather than hope. Those resources demanded stewardship, not sentiment. Who came with us mattered. Who didn't mattered too. Both shaped the group we became, not through intention but through constraint. The fireboat didn't just keep us mobile. It forced us to define the limits of responsibility in motion. And once those limits were set, they moved with us, as constant and unavoidable as the wake trailing behind the hull. Movement kept us alive. Stopping tested whether we deserved to be. That became clear the first time we tried to dock after nightfall, when the river narrowed and the current slowed just enough to make stillness tempting. We needed supplies. Fuel, most of all. Water could be treated. Food could be rationed. Fuel dictated whether the fireboat remained a solution or became a floating trap. From a distance, the dock looked intact. Lights were out, but the structure held. No obvious movement, no sound carrying against the wind. That should have reassured me. Instead, it raised questions. Quiet, near access points rarely meant absence anymore. It meant waiting. I reduced speed early, letting momentum bleed off gradually. Sudden approaches announce intent. Slow ones invite scrutiny. As the hull eased closer, the river lost its buffering effect. Sound sharpened. Voices carried. I heard them before I saw anyone, low and controlled, clustered just beyond the edge of the light. The fireboat's size changed the dynamics immediately. Smaller vessels can slip in unnoticed or be abandoned quickly. This one couldn't. Docking committed us to proximity. The moment lines touched wood, we would be stationary in a space others could reach on foot. Figures emerged as we closed in. Not panicked, positioned. They stood back from the edge, hands visible, spacing deliberate. That posture told me everything. They weren't desperate. They were prepared to negotiate from strength. I killed the engine but kept auxiliary systems live. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. No one rushed us. No one spoke first. That pause mattered. It gave them time to assess numbers, equipment, demeanor. It gave us time to understand that docking had shifted leverage away from movement and toward whoever controlled access. They asked what we wanted, not if we needed help. The phrasing framed the exchange clearly, that this wasn't aid, it was transaction. Supplies existed here, but they weren't free, and the price wouldn't be measured in currency. I answered honestly but briefly. Fuel. Nothing else. I avoided mentioning numbers or duration. Specifics become bargaining chips too quickly. Their response came after consultation I wasn't meant to hear. When they spoke again, they named conditions. Time limit, restricted access. One person ashore at a time. I agreed because refusal would have forced a worse outcome. The river behind us had already narrowed. Turning back under scrutiny invites pursuit. Docking removes momentum. Undocking under pressure costs more than it should. The mechanic went ashore. Not because he was strongest, but because he understood machinery and silence equally well. He moved with awareness, eyes up, hands empty. Every step he took carried risk I couldn't mitigate from the deck. While he worked, the rest of us stayed still. Too still. Stillness draws attention the way blood draws insects. People approached the dock edge gradually, testing distance, not threatening but not passive either. They watched our deck, our supplies, our posture. They weren't counting people. They were counting advantage. I noticed the infected only when one drifted into view behind them, slow and misaligned, drawn by residual noise. No one reacted immediately. That told me they were used to managing it. Someone redirected it casually, like moving furniture out of the way. That casualness unsettled me more than panic would have. Fuel transfer took longer than expected. Equipment here was older, improvised. Each delay stretched tension thinner. I kept my hands visible, body language neutral. Escalation often comes from misunderstanding rather than intent. I didn't want to give either. When the mechanic returned, his nod was subtle. Enough fuel to matter. Not enough to linger. I restarted the engine without ceremony. Noise reclaimed space quickly, disrupting conversation before it could form. Lines came free faster than I liked, but fast enough to avoid hands reaching where they shouldn't. As we pulled away, something hit the hull. Not hard. Not damaging. A thrown object meant to test response. I didn't turn to look. Acknowledgement invites repetition. The river widened again, sound diffusing as distance returned leverage to us. No one followed. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. They had learned what we were willing to trade and how long we would stay. That information would circulate. Once clear, the group exhaled unevenly. Docking hadn't brought relief. It had brought confirmation. The fireboat was safest when moving because movement denied others the time required to calculate advantage. I logged the encounter without detail. Specifics age quickly. Principles last longer. Stopping concentrates risk. Access points invite negotiation. Negotiation under scarcity favors whoever can wait. From then on, docking became a last resort, not a waypoint. We planned movement around it, not toward it. Water offered safety through refusal to settle. The moment we tried to pause, the world pressed back in. The river didn't promise sanctuary, it promised space. Space bought time, time bought choice. Docking surrendered all three at once. We learned that lesson without losing anyone. That counted as success now. The river wasn't empty the way land had become clogged. It was populated in fragments, vessels moving according to logic that didn't align with each other. Every boat carried its own rules, shaped by who was aboard, what they had lost, and how long they'd been moving without rest. Encounters happened without warning. Never neutral, never simple. The first vessel we crossed paths with approached head-on, slow and deliberate. A fishing trawler, oversized for the river, riding low in the water. Nets had been cut loose and trailed uselessly behind it like discarded skin. The crew stood visible on deck, not signaling, not hiding. That openness felt intentional. They wanted to be seen before decisions were made. I adjusted course slightly, not to avoid them, but to clarify intent. On water, minor changes speak loudly. They mirrored the shift. That told me they were watching carefully, not drifting. When we passed within shouting distance, no one spoke. We studied each other in motion, measuring armament, fatigue, confidence. It felt less like strangers meeting, and more like boarders brushing past. Behind us, another boat followed briefly, smaller and faster, keeping distance without explanation. They matched speed but not course, staying just outside comfortable range. I let them trail. A chase invites escalation. A shadow invites patience. After an hour, they peeled off toward a tributary without comment, The encounter left no marks, only questions. Some boats signaled too eagerly. Lights flashed at odd intervals. Radios crackled with voices offering trade before greeting. Those were the most dangerous. Urgency suggests scarcity. Scarcity breeds imbalance. I ignored them without response, letting the fireboat's mass and steady course answer for me. We encountered a barge anchored midstream, engines cold, deck crowded with people who had chosen immobility over risk. They watched us pass with expressions that weren't hostile or hopeful. They had committed to stillness and built defenses around it. That was a different philosophy entirely. I didn't judge it. I understood it wouldn't work for us. Every boat carried assumptions. Some assumed cooperation was inevitable. Others assumed conflict was. Neither extreme lasted long. The ones that survived longest occupied the middle ground, adjusting rules based on context rather than belief. Communication was sparse by design. Radios remained mostly silent. When voices did break through, they spoke in code without intending to. Tone mattered more than words. Calm suggested surplus. Sharpness suggested depletion. Silence suggested calculation. I learned to listen for what wasn't said. No one asked where we were going. No one asked how long we planned to last. Those questions belong to people who believe in endpoints. On the river, endpoints dissolved. Movement replaced destination as the primary goal. One night we were approached by a sailboat moving without lights, wind carrying it faster than expected. They hailed us softly, asking for water. Their approach angle was wrong for desperation. It placed them alongside rather than behind. That positioning mattered. I declined without explanation and altered course just enough to break alignment. They didn't follow. The undead rarely appeared on water directly, but their influence was everywhere. Boats avoided shorelines where movement had thickened. Routes bent around areas of accumulated noise. Every captain was navigating a shifting map built from rumor and observation rather than charted fact. Rules varied wildly. Some crews refused to stop under any circumstances. Others demanded ritualized exchange before allowing proximity. A few attempted authority, claiming jurisdiction that no longer existed. None of it held weight beyond immediate leverage. What bound these encounters together was impermanence. No agreement lasted longer than sightline. No alliance extended past convenience. Water allowed disengagement too easily for long-term coordination to form organically. That made every interaction provisional. The fireboat changed how others treated us. Its size implied capability. Its steadiness implied discipline. We weren't fast, but we were consistent. Consistency attracts respect even when it doesn't invite trust. People adjusted their behavior around us, offering space without invitation. I realized then that survival on water wasn't about dominance or cooperation. It was about legibility, being understandable without being predictable, letting others assess you accurately enough to decide not to interfere. Other boats survived by rewriting rules on the fly. Some succeeded briefly, then vanished. Others lingered too long in one pattern and paid for it. The river tolerated adaptation. It punished rigidity. As days passed, encounters blurred together into a mosaic of short-lived alignments and clean breaks. No single interaction defined our path. Together they shaped it, reinforcing the lesson that movement didn't just keep us alive physically. It kept us socially unanchored. That unanchored state was protection. No one could plan around us. No one could rely on us. No one could corner us easily. The river didn't create a community. It created coexistence without obligation. Other boats, other rules, all moving through the same water without sharing a future. We learned to navigate that reality quietly, understanding that survival wasn't about finding the right group anymore. It was about remaining interpretable, mobile, and just unpredictable enough to be left alone. Fuel became the quiet clock we all learned to hear. Not ticking, not urgent, just present in every calculation. The gauge didn't drop dramatically. It slid, steady and indifferent, reminding us that motion had a cost that couldn't be argued with or ignored. Every adjustment of speed rewrote the future by minutes or hours. We stopped measuring distance in miles. We measured it in burn rate, current against hull, load against output, wind against progress. The fireboat carried weight well, but weight still mattered. Every extra hour of movement narrowed tomorrow's choices. Conservation stopped being a principle and became a reflex. Fatigue arrived faster than fear. Adrenaline had carried us through the first days, sharpening focus and muting discomfort. When it faded, exhaustion filled the space it left behind. Sleep fractured into shallow segments, broken by engine vibration, watch rotations, and the constant need to listen. Rest became functional rather than restorative. No one complained at first. Complaints assumed solutions. We had none. Instead, people grew quieter, movements more economical. Tasks were completed with minimal motion, as if saving energy might stretch time itself. That restraint kept us operational longer than panic ever could. The engine felt the strain before we did. Subtle changes in tone, minor fluctuations in temperature, vibrations that lingered longer than they should have. The mechanic tracked those shifts obsessively, adjusting, compensating, coaxing performance out of components that had already exceeded their expected service life. Every correction felt like buying borrowed time, the kind you pay back later with interest. Hope tried to surface in predictable ways. Rumors carried across the river through radio bursts and shouted exchanges. Safe zones upriver, military presence near the delta, a quarantine line holding somewhere inland. Each story followed the same pattern: vague location, confident tone, no verification. People wanted to believe them not because they were credible, but because they offered endpoints. Endpoints justify sacrifice. Movement without destination erodes morale slowly, even when it preserves life. I didn't repeat the rumors. I let them circulate on their own. Denying them outright would have made me an obstacle. Endorsing them would have turned me into a liability. Silence became the least harmful option. As days blurred, small mistakes crept in. A missed watch change. A valve left half open. A conversation repeated because no one remembered having it already. None of it was catastrophic. Together they formed a pattern that worried me more than any single threat. Fatigue doesn't announce itself loudly. It lowers margins quietly. Reactions slow. Assumptions go unchallenged. You start trusting routine instead of verifying conditions. On water, that shift can be fatal. We adjusted schedules to compensate, but adjustment has limits. You can't out-organize depletion indefinitely. Bodies and machines wear down together, and neither responds well to optimism. The false hope hurt more than the truth would have. Each unverified story created a mental waypoint that pulled attention forward. When we didn't reach it, disappointment settled heavier than if nothing had been expected at all. I watched it happen and felt responsible without knowing how to prevent it. I finally addressed it indirectly. Not by correcting rumors, but by reframing purpose. I talked about the boat instead of destinations, about keeping it running, about staying ahead of accumulation, about maintaining flexibility. Those were goals that could be achieved daily, sometimes hourly. The shift helped. Focus narrowed. People stopped asking when we would arrive somewhere and started asking what needed to be checked next. Hope didn't disappear. It changed shape, shrinking to fit reality instead of fighting it. Fuel continued to drop. Fatigue continued to build. Neither cared about morale. They enforced truth through arithmetic and biology. One evening, as the river widened and the engine settled into a strained but steady rhythm, I realized something that would have sounded defeatist earlier. We weren't failing to reach safety. Safety no longer existed as a place. What we had instead was continuity, motion sustained by attention, attention sustained by discipline, discipline sustained by acceptance. False hope had been the last luxury of the stationary world. On the Fireboat, we learned to let it go before it cost us something we couldn't replace. The river didn't reward belief. It rewarded awareness. That lesson arrived slowly, enforced by fuel consumption and aching joints, until it stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like clarity we could work with. We learned the cost of movement the same way we learned everything else, by watching patterns shift after we thought we'd adapted. For days, mobility had protected us. Distance diluted threat. The river refused accumulation. Motion kept us from becoming a point on anyone's map. Then the attention started to feel different. It wasn't pursuit at first, it was recognition. I noticed it in how other vessels adjusted when we appeared. Early on, boats treated us like weather, something to work around without engagement. Now, course changes lingered longer. Speed matched more deliberately. Lights flicked on, then off as if someone was testing visibility rather than signaling distress. The Fireboat had become legible. Our wake was part of it. Heavy displacement leaves a signature. Even when we throttled back, the water remembered us longer than smaller craft. That wake carried information, size, direction, recent passage. Anyone paying attention could follow it for a while without seeing us directly. Sound travelled farther too. Engines echoed differently at night, flattening distance and stripping nuance. What once blended into background noise began announcing continuity. We weren't just moving anymore, we were persisting. Persistence attracts curiosity. Curiosity invites calculation. The first sign of focused attention came after dusk, when a vessel appeared off our port side without warning, pacing us at range. They didn't close distance, they didn't hail us. They simply stayed there, maintaining parallel movement with unnerving precision. That kind of control doesn't come from desperation. It comes from intent. I altered course gradually, not to flee, but to test commitment. They mirrored the change after a delay long enough to confirm it wasn't coincidence. That delay mattered. It meant they were deciding, not reacting. We let the river bend between us, using terrain to break line of sight. They dropped back, then reappeared farther ahead, as if repositioning. That escalation shifted the calculus. This wasn't opportunistic contact, it was assessment. The infected didn't factor into moments like this. They were environmental hazard, not strategic actor. Human attention was different. It adapted. It learned. I shut down all unnecessary systems, reducing noise as much as possible without sacrificing control. Lights stayed off. Movement slowed. We became harder to read, but easier to predict. Slower speed means fewer options if pressure increases. Every choice traded one vulnerability for another. The group felt it immediately. Conversation stopped. Everyone understood that mobility alone was no longer enough. Motion had shifted from shield to signal. We were advertising endurance in a world where endurance was becoming rare. The vessel finally broke off before dawn without explanation. No confrontation. No exchange. Just absence where presence had been. That uncertainty lingered longer than threat would have. Unresolved attention creates future risk. After that night, patterns changed. Boats that had previously avoided us now watched longer. Shorelines that once felt neutral began producing movement timed to our passage. We weren't being hunted yet, but we were being catalogued. Mobility had stopped being anonymous. I adjusted strategy accordingly. Routes varied more aggressively, speed fluctuated without pattern. We doubled back occasionally, not to return, but to disrupt expectation. Predictability is what turns attention into pursuit. Still, attention continued accumulating in subtle ways. Short radio transmissions cut off when we entered range. Distant lights blinked once, then went dark. The river had started talking about us without using words. The realization was uncomfortable but necessary. Staying mobile doesn't eliminate threat, it postpones it until you become interesting enough to notice. We had crossed that threshold by surviving longer than expected. The fireboat had turned into a resource others couldn't ignore. Not because it was powerful, but because it kept moving when most things didn't. In scarcity, continuity itself becomes valuable. We had to decide what kind of attention we could afford. Short-term curiosity was manageable. Sustained interest wasn't. That meant limiting visibility, even if it reduced efficiency. Burning less fuel didn't matter if it drew pursuit that burned everything at once. I made a decision that night without announcing it. Mobility would remain our foundation, but it would no longer be obvious. We would move less directly, pause more often in places that broke sightlines. Let the river hide us when it could. Movement had saved us. Now it needed restraint to keep doing so. The lesson settled, heavily but cleanly. Survival isn't about maximizing one advantage. It's about knowing when an advantage has begun to price itself too high. We didn't stop moving. We just stopped advertising that we could. The plan started as most plans do under collapse, quietly, almost accidentally, shaped more by constraint than ambition. No one announced it, no one voted. It formed out of overlapping needs that finally aligned long enough to pretend they were a direction. Fuel was the forcing function. Always fuel. We couldn't drift indefinitely, and hiding too well meant losing access entirely. We needed a stretch of river with low traffic, defensible approaches, and enough cover to stop without becoming visible from miles away. Not safety. Just breathing room. Someone mentioned an upriver industrial bend, long abandoned, where warehouses had collapsed into themselves years ago. No marinas, no ramps, just concrete skeletons and shallow access points. It wasn't a destination anyone would choose in a better world, which made it attractive now. Obscurity had become currency. The plan wasn't to settle, it was to reset. Refuel if possible. Rest the engine. Let bodies recover enough to think clearly again. We framed it carefully, even internally. Temporary, conditional. No one said the word stay. That mattered. We approached the bend cautiously, throttling down early using the river's curve to hide our arrival. The fireboat slid into the shadow of ruined structures that broke sightlines cleanly. Sound dulled. The engine quieted. For the first time in days, movement stopped without immediately inviting pressure. Relief came in uneven waves. Some people sat immediately, backs against steel, eyes closing without permission. Others stayed standing, scanning, unable to trust stillness yet. I felt both impulses at once and ignored them equally. Plans collapse fastest when relief is mistaken for resolution. The first hours passed without incident. No boats approached. No lights flickered across the water. The river continued moving past us, indifferent to our pause. That normalcy tempted reinterpretation. Maybe this could work longer than intended. Maybe we'd found a pocket the collapse hadn't filled yet. That thought was the plan's first fracture. We found limited fuel in a half-flooded storage area nearby, old but usable with filtration. Enough to matter, not enough to change the long-term math. Still, it extended our range. That extension created optimism we didn't question quickly enough. The infected appeared at dusk, not drawn by us, but already present. Trapped in low areas, wedged among debris, slow and uncoordinated. They weren't a threat yet. They were a reminder. Accumulation happens quietly while you rest. We adjusted, cleared space, maintained distance. Everything remained manageable until sound carried farther than expected. Not from us. From upriver, engines, multiple, approaching without subtlety. The plan hadn't accounted for others choosing the same obscurity for the same reasons. Lights appeared briefly, then vanished as vessels rounded the bend. They slowed when they saw us. Not surprised, evaluative. We were no longer a moving variable. We were a known quantity in a fixed position. Negotiation began before anyone spoke. Course adjustments, spacing, how long they lingered before committing. I restarted the engine without fully powering up, enough to signal capability without escalation. The fireboat responded reluctantly, as if annoyed at being asked to change state again. The moment stretched. No one attacked. No one retreated. Everyone waited for someone else to define the interaction. That stalemate was the plan's second fracture. I realized then what we'd done wrong. We had mistaken obscurity for isolation. Obscure places still attract those who understand the same logic. When you stop moving, you join a category others are actively searching for. I didn't wait for consensus. I gave the order to leave without raising my voice. The engine protested, then complied. Lines were cast off faster than they should have been. The boats upriver reacted immediately, adjusting course in ways that suggested disappointment rather than aggression. We moved away before pressure could decide for us. The plan partially worked. We rested. We refueled. We learned. It failed in the only way that mattered. It created the illusion that stillness could be controlled. It can't. Stillness advertises. Movement obscures. As we cleared the bend and the river reclaimed us, I felt something solidify rather than break. The plan wasn't a mistake. It was a test. Tests are meant to end. We didn't lose anyone. We didn't trade anything irreversible. That counted as success under new rules. The lesson stayed with us more clearly than any fuel calculation. Plans that depend on conditions remaining unchanged are already outdated. The river doesn't punish planning. It punishes attachment. From then on, every plan carried an expiration date built into it. Not failure. Not abandonment. Just an understanding that survival isn't about finding the right place. It's about knowing when to leave before the place starts making decisions for you. At some point, the idea of arrival stopped making sense. Not gradually, not philosophically, but practically. Every route that promised an end eventually folded back into the same questions we'd already answered. How long can we stay? Who will notice? And what happens when they do? Endpoints assumed permission. The river never asked for that. We stopped talking about where we were going. Conversations shifted toward how we were moving. Speed, noise, wake, timing. Decisions became operational rather than aspirational. That change felt subtle at first, but it reshaped everything. Without an endpoint, pressure eased in unexpected ways. There was nothing to rush toward, nothing to defend as permanent. The fireboat settled into a role that went beyond transportation. It became context. Our routines formed around its needs, not because it demanded loyalty, but because it defined possibility. Fuel dictated rhythm. Maintenance dictated rest. The river dictated direction. We adapted without resistance because resistance required belief in an alternative. Days blurred into a sequence of adjustments, some small, some decisive. We learned which stretches of water amplified sound and which absorbed it, where fog lingered longest, where current masked wake. Knowledge accumulated not as maps, but as instincts. We stopped recording it. Recording assumes you'll need to teach someone later. Fatigue remained, but it changed texture. It no longer came from panic or indecision. It came from continuity, the kind that doesn't break you quickly, but wears edges smooth over time. People spoke less, not out of despair, but efficiency. Words became tools rather than comfort. The group stabilized in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without a promised destination, hierarchies softened. No one competed for control of a future that wasn't defined. Authority existed where competence showed itself. That shifted fluidly, without argument. Survival doesn't reward titles, it rewards accuracy. We encountered others who still chased endpoints, safe zones, fortified islands. military checkpoints rumored to exist just beyond the next bend. They spoke with urgency that felt familiar and distant at the same time. I recognized my earlier thinking in their certainty and didn't try to correct it. Everyone needs their own timeline to let go. Some of those boats disappeared days later. Others reappeared changed, quieter, less convinced. A few never came back into our orbit at all. The river absorbed them without comment. Continuity doesn't guarantee visibility. I thought often about how much energy I'd once spent imagining outcomes: success, failure, rescue, collapse. Living without an endpoint removed that entire layer of speculation. It narrowed focus to what was immediately actionable. The future became something that arrived incrementally, not something to be reached. There were moments of calm that felt almost like peace, though I never trusted them fully. Calm can be deceptive when it's borrowed from exhaustion. Still, those moments mattered. They reminded us that survival wasn't meant to feel like constant crisis. It could feel like maintenance, repetition, even routine. The undead faded into background risk rather than central threat. They shaped movement indirectly, thickening shorelines and redirecting traffic, but they rarely forced decisions outright. Humans remained the variable, always adapting, always watching, always learning. So we learned too. Living without an endpoint didn't mean giving up. It meant redefining success. Success became staying uncornered, staying flexible, staying unreadable enough to avoid being folded into someone else's plan. It meant understanding that permanence had become a liability. The fireboat aged with us. Wear showed in places that couldn't be hidden. Repairs became more frequent, more creative. We stopped aiming for perfection and focused on function. That mindset extended beyond the machine. People adjusted the same way. Flaws acknowledged. Limits respected. One night, as the river widened and the sky cleared enough to show stars distorted by reflection, I realized something that would have terrified me weeks earlier. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not rescue, not collapse, not resolution. I was moving. That movement didn't promise survival forever, nothing did. But it kept us from becoming static targets in a world that punished stillness. It allowed change without commitment, direction without destination. Living without an endpoint wasn't despair. It was adaptation. The river kept flowing, the fireboat kept moving, and as long as both remained true, we would too. Not toward safety, not toward hope, but toward whatever came next, ready to adjust again without needing permission or a place to finally stop.